Helen Keller. Helen Adams Keller, born on June 27, 1880, died on June 1, 1968, was an American author, disability rights advocate, political activist and lecturer. Born in West Tuscumbia, Alabama, she lost her sight and her hearing after a bout of illness at the age of 19 months. She then communicated primarily using home signs until the age of 7, when she met her first teacher and lifelong companion, Anne Sullivan. This young woman taught Keller language, including reading and writing. After an education at both specialist and mainstream schools, Keller attended Radcliffe College of Harvard University and became the first deaf-blind person to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree. She worked for the American Foundation for the Blind, AFB, from 1924 until 1968. During this time, she toured the United States and traveled to 35 countries around the globe advocating for those with vision loss. Keller was also a prolific author, writing 14 books and hundreds of speeches and essays on topics ranging from animals to Mahatma Gandhi. Keller campaigned for those with disabilities, for women's suffrage, labor rights, and world peace. In 1909, she joined the Socialist Party of America. She was a founding member of the American Civil Liberties Union. Keller's 1903 autobiography, The Story of My Life, publicized her education and life with Sullivan. It was adapted as a play by William Gibson, and this was also adapted as a film under the same title, The Miracle Worker. Her birthplace has been designated and preserved as a National Historic Landmark. Since 1954, it has been operated as a house museum and sponsors an annual Helen Keller Day. Keller was inducted into the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame in 1971. She was one of 12 inaugural inductees to the newly founded Alabama Writers Hall of Fame on June 8, 2015. In May 1888, Keller started attending the Perkins Institute for the Blind. In 1894, Keller and Sullivan moved to New York to attend the Wright-Humason School for the Deaf and to learn from Sarah Fuller at the Horace Mann School for the Deaf. In 1896, they returned to Massachusetts, and Keller entered the Cambridge School for Young Ladies before gaining admittance. In 1900, to Radcliffe College of Harvard University, where she lived in Briggs Hall, South House. Her admirer, Mark Twain, had introduced her to Standard Oil magnate Henry Huddleston Rogers, who, with his wife Abby, paid for her education. In 1904, at the age of 24, Keller graduated as a member of Phi Beta Kappa from Radcliffe, becoming the first deaf-blind person to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree. She maintained a correspondence with the Austrian philosopher and pedagogue Wilhelm Jerusalem, who was one of the first to discover her literary talent. Determined to communicate with others as conventionally as possible, Keller learned to speak and spent much of her life giving speeches and lectures on aspects of her life. She learned to hear people's speech using the Tadoma method, which means using her fingers to feel the lips and throat of the speaker. She became proficient at using Braille and using fingerspelling to communicate. Shortly before World War I, with the assistance of the Zollner Quartet, she determined that by placing her fingertips on a resonant tabletop, she could experience music played close by. Keller became a world-famous speaker and author. She was an advocate for people with disabilities, amid numerous other causes. She traveled to 25 different countries giving motivational speeches about deaf people's conditions. She was a suffragist, pacifist, radical socialist, birth control supporter, and opponent of Woodrow Wilson. In 1915, she and George A. Kessler founded the Helen Keller International (HKI) organization. This organization is devoted to research in vision, health, and nutrition. In 1916, she sent money to the NAACP, as she was ashamed of the Southern UN Christian treatment of colored people. In 1920, she helped to found the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU. Keller traveled to over 40 countries with Sullivan, making several trips to Japan and becoming a favorite of the Japanese people. Keller met every U.S. president from Grover Cleveland to Lyndon B. Johnson, and was friends with many famous figures, including Alexander Graham Bell, Charlie Chaplin, and Mark Twain. Keller and Twain were both considered political radicals allied with leftist politics. Keller, who believed that the poor were ground down by industrial oppression, wanted children born into poor families to have the same opportunities to succeed that she had enjoyed. She wrote, "I owed my success partly to the advantages of my birth and environment. I have learned that the power to rise is not within the reach of everyone." In 1909, Keller became a member of the Socialist Party. She actively campaigned and wrote in support of the working class from 1909 to 1921. Many of her speeches and writings were about women's right to vote and the effects of war. In addition, she supported causes that opposed military intervention. She had speech therapy in order to have her voice understood better by the public. When the Rockefeller-owned press refused to print her articles, she protested until her work was finally published. She supported Socialist Party candidate Eugene V. Debs in each of his campaigns for the presidency. Before reading Progress and Poverty by Henry George, Helen Keller was already a socialist who believed that Georgism was a good step in the right direction. She later wrote of finding in Henry George's philosophy a rare beauty and power of inspiration, and a splendid faith in the essential nobility of human nature. Keller claimed that newspaper columnists who had praised her courage and intelligence before she expressed her socialist views now called attention to her disabilities. The editor of the Brooklyn Eagle wrote that her mistakes sprung out of the manifest limitations of her development. Keller responded to that editor, referring to having met him before he knew of her political views. "At that time the compliments he paid me were so generous that I blush to remember them. But now that I have come out for socialism, he reminds me and the public that I am blind and deaf, and especially liable to error. I must have shrunk in intelligence during the years since I met him." Oh, ridiculous Brooklyn Eagle! Socially blind and deaf, it defends an intolerable system, a system that is the cause of much of the physical blindness and deafness which we are trying to prevent. Keller joined the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, known as the Wobblies, in 1912, saying that parliamentary socialism was sinking in the political bog. She wrote for the IWW between 1916 and 1918. In Why I Became an IWW, Keller explained that her motivation for activism came in part from her concern about blindness and other disabilities. "I was appointed on a commission to investigate the conditions of the blind. For the first time I, who had thought blindness a misfortune beyond human control, found that too much of it was traceable to wrong industrial conditions, often caused by the selfishness and greed of employers. And the social evil contributed its share. I found that poverty drove women to a life of shame that ended in blindness." The last sentence refers to prostitution and syphilis, the former a life of shame that women used to support themselves, which contributed to their contracting syphilis. Untreated, it was a leading cause of blindness. In the same interview, Keller also cited the 1912 strike of textile workers in Lawrence, Massachusetts for instigating her support of socialism. Keller supported eugenicsm, which had become popular with new understandings, as well as misapprehensions, of principles of biological inheritance. In 1915, she wrote in favor of refusing life-saving medical procedures to infants with severe mental impairments or physical deformities, saying that their lives were not worthwhile and they would likely become criminals. Keller also expressed concerns about human overpopulation. Keller wrote a total of 12 published books and several articles. One of her earliest pieces of writing, at age 11, was The Frost King, 1891. There were allegations that this story had been plagiarized from The Frost Fairies by Margaret Canby. An investigation into the matter revealed that Keller may have experienced a case of cryptomnesia, which was that she had Canby's story read to her but forgot about it, while the memory remained in her subconscious. At age 22, Keller published her autobiography, The Story of My Life, 1903, with help from Sullivan and Sullivan's husband, John Macy. It recounts the story of her life up to age 21, and was written during her time in college. In an article Keller wrote in 1907, she brought to public attention the fact that many cases of childhood blindness could be prevented by washing the eyes of every newborn baby with a disinfectant solution. At the time, only a fraction of doctors and midwives were doing this. Thanks to Keller's advocacy, this common-sense public health measure was swiftly and widely adopted. On September 14, 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of the United States' two highest civilian honors. In 1965, she was elected to the National Women's Hall of Fame at the New York World's Fair. Keller devoted much of her later life to raising funds for the American Foundation for the Blind. She died in her sleep on June 1, 1968, at her home, Arkin Ridge, located in Easton, Connecticut, a few weeks short of her 88th birthday. A service was held in her honor at the Washington National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. Her body was cremated, and her ashes were buried there next to her constant companions, Anne Sullivan and Polly Thompson. Thanks for watching HerStory channel. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe our channel.